Okay, so it's been a while since I've done this, but I'm going to continue my series on British Prime Ministers, which is basically relatively short videos just with a general outline of the 53 men and one woman who have served as our First Lord of the Treasury, which is the other title for that, except for a brief period in the 1870s and 1890s when the First Lord of the Treasury was not the Prime Minister. But generally speaking, that is a contiguous term. Um, So I've got up to Prime Minister 21. Obviously, it's been a while, so if you recall, the last Prime Minister I covered was Viscount Godric, who is one of our least known Prime Ministers. Well, the person I'm about to talk about is one of our best known, though much more as a military figure than a politician, and that is Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington. Um, Now, Wellington, of course, is very famous as a general, as a military commander. Um, He was actually ranked among our top generals, and he is among the top generals in European military history. So he's a very famous character. Um, as a general, I'm just going to speak about this briefly because the main point is about him as a prime minister. But as a general, he was said to be quite a firm leader. Different generals have different styles, and whereas Marlborough, I believe, and some other famous British generals were more in touch with the troops, Wellington was actually said to be quite a distant and hard figure, which I suppose has its assets for a man of war, but he was not necessarily loved by his troops in the same way that other generals were, but he was deeply respected. That's my understanding. I watched a series on famous British generals. Um, and in 2002, it's worth noting that he was ranked number 15 in the BBC poll of the 100 Greatest Britons. That was basically a poll to decide who should be our Greatest Britain. Wellesley ranked at 15th, so pretty high. Um, but that's much more likely for his role as a military leader than a politician. Actually, I should give him his correct title, Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, which is what he ascended to. So a bit of background about Wellesley. He was born in Dublin in 1769 as part of the Anglo-Irish Ascendancy. Basically, this is people who were mixed Irish Anglo, and they were descended from the plantation settlers of the 16th and 17th centuries. Um, and that line still exists. One prominent example today is Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne. The Osborne baronetcy apparently descends also from the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. Um, so he was from a prominent family in Dublin. Um, and after his military career, he entered politics, I believe, in middle age. He was relatively old when he was in politics. Some of the famous battles I should briefly mention that he was victor over was Waterloo in 1815, Assaye in 1803, and Vittoria in 1813. He engaged in some 60 battles and his military career was seen to be exemplary. Um, Now, as politician, as prime minister, he was a Tory, and he first came into office in 1828. That's leading on from Viscount Godric, and he served until 1830. He then had a second very brief spell in office in 1834. So his total time in office was less than 3 years. Um, and during that time, some important events happened. The Roman Catholic Relief Act. At this time, Britain was not a large secular state. Religion still had a lot of importance. Um, and this basically removed many of the restrictions on Roman Catholicism in the United Kingdom. Ever since the English Reformation under Henry VIII, there had been a gradual up and down, not consistent, but a gradual um, erosion of Catholic rights in the United Kingdom. Like I say, this wasn't consistent because there were Catholic monarchs in that gap who arguably would have done exactly the same to Anglicans. But basically, the point is religion at that time was significant than it is today in the United Kingdom. So Catholic emancipation was a major act. The Reform Act, the Great Reform Act of 1832, didn't occur in Wellington's term, but it did occur between his terms. He was a staunch opponent of reform, um, and he worked energetically to try and prevent its passage. So he was in opposition to people like Russell and Grey. In doing so, that made him actually quite unpopular with the public because this was a very populist bill, and it basically apparently his windows in London in Belgravia were smashed by an angry mob. Um, so Wellington wasn't universally popular. Um, Another major act during his time in Parliament, again not his time as Prime Minister, but in his time in Parliament, was Jewish emancipation. Um, Again, at this time, there was issues to do with anti-Semitism. For example, Jews couldn't take their seat in the House of Commons. And this is from a Wikipedia article because I'm being lazy. But during debate on the Jewish Civil Disabilities Repeal Bill, Wellington, who opposed the bill, stated in Parliament in 1833, "This is a Christian country and a Christian legislature, and the effect of this measure would be to remove that peculiar character. And I see no ground whatsoever for passing the bill, shall therefore vote against it." So Wellington was obviously quite a hardline conservative. He was opposed to all sorts of reforms. Um, his time in office, it wasn't particularly remarkable. Other than those things that I've mentioned, there wasn't a great deal to say. Wellington's boots were named after him. I'm not sure how he popularized them. You know, the rubber boots that you use on Glastonbury or on wet days, they were named in his honour. So that's two British prime ministers were commodities, one who had commodities named after them. In fact, there was a third, and I may or may not forget it when I make the video, but I'll just mention it now anyway. Anthony Eden. Eden hats were a popular fashion accessory in the 1950s. Then there's Earl Grey tea and Wellington boots, worth bearing in mind. Um, so there isn't much more to say about his political career really, because it was quite brief in terms of his time in Parliament. Um, Obviously, he got a cast iron reputation due to his military career. He became known as the Iron Duke. There is a story that in 1805, Major General Wellesley um, met then Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, who was another great British military hero. Nelson was never a politician in the same way, but it was said that I'm just reading this now. Actually, it's quite interesting. Um, yeah, it's the only time these two great British military heroes won, one for the Navy, one for the Army. Sorry, the only time they ever met. So that would have been an interesting meeting. Nelson was a bit older than Wellesley. Um, by the way, Wellington is a small town in Somerset. I'm not quite sure where the connection came from. I'm not sure why he ascended to that peerage in particular. If he had family connections there, I'm not quite sure about that. And because of his fame and because of his, I keep coming back to the military issue, but that can't be overlooked. Because of his military prestige, there's statues to Wellesley all over the country. He's been featured in media many times, many films, um, many TV shows. For example, Sharp, the series on the Napoleonic Wars, featured the Duke of Wellington, and there's numerous others. So that was it basically. That's a bit of background to Wellington. Um, it said that he I'm just looking at an interesting article here that's saying that he hated railways and he hated the rise of trains. Um, yeah, so low in life he hated travelling by rail. After death, his body was taken to London where he was given a state funeral. And only a handful of British subjects have been given that honour. Churchill was another, and one or two other non-royal figures have been given a state funeral. But it is very rare. So that shows the sort of prestige in which he was held. Prestige as opposed to being loved. I'm not sure if Wellington was necessarily loved because he was quite a solemn and rigid figure. That's the impression I get. Um, I'm sure he would have had the ability to tell jokes and so on at balls. But what I mean is, he certainly wasn't in touch with the common man. Um, so I think that's worth noting. The earliest mention of the Wellesley name comes from 1180 around a settlement known as Wellesley Farm. The family had been granted lands to the south of Wales, Somerset, for their passive acceptance of the Norman conquest in 1066. So that would explain the Somerset connection. Um, as far as I know, the peerage, Wellington, I'm just checking if that continued after him. Um, yes, this peerage actually still exists. Um, and the current Dukedom of Wellington doesn't say who that's currently held for, but basically it's still a dorm as an active title. Um, okay, so just round this up. I just don't want to miss anything because Wellington is such a famous figure. Um, so two brief spells in office, 1828, 1830, and 1834. Um, the king at that time was King William IV. Prior to being prime minister, I should say, he had been foreign secretary, home secretary. Actually, he'd become foreign secretary just after his second stint, but he'd been secretary of state for war in the colonies, home secretary, foreign secretary just after he left his second term, and leader of the House of Lords on three occasions. So he did have quite a substantial political portfolio as well. Um, and it was said that he had very little sleep. He always awoke early. Um, finally, to round up, he died in 1852 in Walmer Castle in Kent, and he was 83 years old. Um, and as far as I know, his resting place is, like I say, he was given a state funeral. Apologies here because as I'm reading, I'm just looking at the article. Um, this is interesting. After his death, Irish and English newspapers disputed whether Wellington had been born an Irishman or an Englishman. Um, and during his life, he had openly disliked being referred to as an Irishman, and so he is classed as a Great Britain. Um, I'm just looking to see where his resting place is. Wellington's tomb, St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral, to my American viewers, is basically like St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey. Those two places are basically very prestigious places. Okay, I've spoken a bit longer than my usual videos on prime ministers, but obviously there was a bit more to say about Wellington. So that is 21st Prime Minister Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington.